You think we go for it?
Okay, Paolo and Dominik, are you ready?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm ready.
Okay.
Perfect.
Good. Well, welcome everybody who's joined this this webinar. It's really good to see such strong interest. We have already 26 people tuned in, which is really good. My name is Brian Lucas. I manage the Governance and Social Development Resource Centre, and I'm based here at the University of Birmingham in the UK. I'm here with Simon DeLay, who's a lecturer here in Birmingham, specializing in public financial management, and he's recently completed a study mapping the evidence base on public financial management. Today's webinar is one of a series of events which the GSDRC is organizing in 2015 and 2016. The series is supported by DFID as part of DFID's professional development activities for its own staff, but all the events are open to the public with the aim of involving the whole international development community. And you can find out more about the upcoming events on our website, gsdrc.org. This event is being recorded, and the recording will be made available on the website as soon as possible after the event. If you would like to make a question, or ask a question, or make a comment at any time, type your message in the chat box, which you should see on the side of your screen. I see many of you have started just by saying hello and introducing yourselves, which is really nice. It's nice to know who it is that is out there in the audience, even though we can't see you. Once each of the speakers has finished their opening presentations, we'll answer as many of the questions that you put in the chat box as we can in the time we have available. Public financial management is a core public administration activity, and it's part of the fundamental infrastructure of public administration. The government can contract out many activities like service delivery, but it can't really contract out the central function of planning and budgeting. So improving PFM systems is really important in any state. But we being in international development, we're particularly interested in the contribution that PFM can make to state building and peace building in fragile and conflict-affected states. And effective and efficient financial management is necessary to pay for essential public services, to allocate resources that can be used for recovery and reconstruction. It can help address horizontal and vertical inequalities, and can even strengthen the social contract between state and citizen. But to achieve these kinds of goals, there's many challenges to look at. And so we're pleased today to welcome two speakers who will discuss key aspects of this: transparency, participation, and corruption in public financial management. We've asked each of the speakers to start off with a 15 or 20-minute presentation, and then that should leave us a good 45 minutes or so for open discussion. Paolo de Renzio is a senior research fellow at the International Budget Partnership in Washington, where he coordinates a research program on governance, fiscal transparency, and development, and he's part of the team that produces the Open Budget Index. He's also an adjunct professor at the Institute for International Relations at the Pontificia Universidade Católica of Rio de Janeiro. He's worked in the Ministry of Finance in Papua New Guinea, with UNDP in Mozambique, as a research fellow at ODI, and recently co-edited the book Open Budgets, The Political Economy of Transparency, Participation, and Accountability. Our second speaker will be Dominik Zaum. He's a professor of governance, conflict, and security, and head of the School of Politics, Economics, and International Relations at the University of Reading in the UK. He's worked with the UK Stabilization Unit, with the UN in Kosovo, at the Office of the High Representative in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and he's written and edited 6 books, most recently Legitimating International Organizations. So I'd like to invite Paolo to begin with your presentation, Paolo, on transparency and participation in PFM.
Great. Thank you very much, Brian, and hello to everybody. I think we've already gone up to 33 attendees, and I already see some not known faces but known names in the chat box. So that's great to have people listening on this. This is my short presentation is of course based on the reading pack that I've done a few months ago for the GSDRC that you can find on the website. There's a couple of more recent updates in terms of more recent publications that have come out that I will mention. But basically, I will try and go through some of the material I've covered in that reading pack and reflect a little bit on issues related to transparency and participation in public financial management, which is in many ways the bread and butter of much of what we do at the International Budget Partnership, but also a key area of my research over the past few years. So I only have a very limited number of slides. Let me go through them and hopefully give more room for discussion and questions. I'll start with some sort of overall remarks on sort of some history and where we are with transparency and participation in public financial management. If we look at fiscal or budget transparency, it's quite interesting. People think it's sort of a recent phenomenon, and it certainly has gained quite a lot of fame in recent years. But it has actually quite a long history. You can trace back mentions of citizens' rights to have access to public accounts all the way back to Aristotle's Politics, or more recently to the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, key document of the French Revolution in 1789. So it's actually it's not something new. It's an idea that has been around for a long time, but it's certainly something that has become a lot more talked about in recent years. The IMF published its Code of Good Practice on fiscal transparency in the late 90s after the Asian financial crisis, and since then there's been a lot of attention and a number of different initiatives that look at the issue of budget and fiscal transparency in a number of different ways and in a number of different areas. So that means that there has been sort of a somewhat established consensus on what transparency in public financial management means. What are some of the key aspects of what it means for budgets to be transparent and for government public financial management systems to be open to the public, and to an increasing extent also how it can be measured. So, and here mostly there's a number of tools and assessments that I will cite shortly, but there's basically quite an established consensus on all of this. And there's definitely been an expanding range of activities and initiatives in the development field more generally, and in development cooperation more specifically. To cite just a few, you can think about the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, the International Aid Transparency Initiative, the Open Government Partnership, the Open Contracting Partnership, some of the work that IBP does on the Open Budget Survey, for example. So there's definitely been a lot of interest and a lot of activity in this area, both assessing but also promoting budget and fiscal transparency across a large number of countries. If we look at the participation side, actually things are not as clear-cut. There's a lot less consensus on whether there should be participation in the budget process. People or sort of officials in the executive arm of government think that it is, sort of their own prerogative to trace the key lines of budget policy for a government. They're keen, they're increasingly keen to make information available to the public on different aspects of fiscal policy, but they're not necessarily very keen to open the doors and let civil society groups or other actors in to sort of design and monitor fiscal policy with them. But this is an area where at least there's been a lot of interest. And just to cite a couple of issues that have come up here recently, if you look at the IMF's new Code of Fiscal Transparency, which has been updated over the course of the past couple of years, there's a mention in there of the need for governments to open up channels and mechanisms for these citizens to engage with fiscal policy making and implementation. And similarly, in a recently published OECD Principles for Budgetary Governance, there's also one of the principles that talks about engaging different actors in budget policy making. And finally, just to sort of wrap this up, the Global Initiative for Fiscal Transparency, some of you may not have heard about it. It's a global multi-stakeholder initiative that was spearheaded by IBP, but that now comprises a number of other actors like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, a number of governments, led by the government of Brazil and the government of the Philippines. And it's done some work around setting up sort of a global normative architecture around the transparency and participation in public financial management, and it has done quite a lot of work in around the idea that participation and citizen engagement in budget processes should be promoted. So I've included one of the more recent gift papers in the reading pack, but there's a lot more information and publications on the GIFT website that you can consult if needed, including a series of country case studies of participation practices in the budget process that are quite interesting and that are now being synthesized as well. So on one hand, on the transparency side, long history, a lot of recent attention, and an established consensus on what transparency in PFM means and how it can be measured. On the participation side, a lot less consensus, a lot more controversy whether it is something that can and should be promoted, but a lot of interest and engagement by a number of international actors trying to sort of sort out some key definitions and some key operationalizations of the concept with a view to promote it more widely. Now, if we move to the issue of evidence, so we've spoken about the sort of the concepts and the importance of the concepts. One of the key issues that the reading packs look at is the issue of evidence. How much evidence is there around these issues that can guide policy interventions or donor interventions or any other type of policy engagement that we may think of? And here there's sort of two types of evidence that I would like to talk about. The first type is evidence on what is happening, what are levels of transparency and participation in PFM, what are some of the tools and assessment mechanisms that can help us understand the state of things in different countries. And then there's the key question about what evidence there is that they actually make any difference. So impact evidence of different sorts. So again, looking at transparency and participation in sequence, if we look at transparency, I would say that sort of the two key sources of data and analysis on this are the International Monetary Fund and the International Budget Partnership. The IMF, as I said, has been working in this area for more than 15 years. It published its first code in 1998 and has carried out a number of fiscal transparency assessments, mostly in the early years of this new century. It has recently overhauled and redesigned its code and has just started using a new assessment tool called the Fiscal Transparency Evaluation. There's been a number of them that have been already produced and published, and a bunch of others that are underway. So there's a wealth of data and analysis that the IMF produces on fiscal transparency, mostly focused on the IMF's area of expertise and focus, which is basically assessing fiscal risk and improving fiscal management practices, in this case from a fiscal transparency point of view. The International Budget Partnership, as some of you may know, has been producing and publishing the Open Budget Survey since 2006. It is a survey that assesses and measures levels of budget transparency across countries. In its latest round, which was only published a couple of months ago, we cover 102 countries. We look at a key set of 8 budget documents that all governments should produce, and we independently assess whether they are publicly available and the level of detail and comprehensiveness of the information that they include. In more recent rounds, this survey also includes questions on the strength of oversight institutions, looking at legislatures and supreme audit institutions, and more recently some questions on participation that I'll get back to in a second. But there's also sort of beyond what the IMF and the IBP produce, there's also some indicators in the PFA assessment tool that look at different aspects of budget transparency. And there are some questions in the OECD budget practices and procedures database that also provide some information on budget transparency practices across countries. So all of these different sources of information can be utilized by different actors to obtain data and analysis of levels of budget and fiscal transparency, or sort of different countries' performance in these areas, both across a reasonably large number of countries and increasingly over time. So on the transparency side, there's quite a bit of evidence out there that people can use. On the impact side, since the reading pack came out, we've actually completed a piece of work which you can see in the which you can see the cover of on the slide, which is called the Impacts of Fiscal Openness, which was sort of a comprehensive review of research evidence that exists out there on the extent to which fiscal transparency and participation have brought about positive impacts across countries. The headline finding is that there is limited, meaning there is not much research out there trying to answer this question, but whatever evidence there is, it does show positive impact from fiscal transparency interventions and fiscal participation interventions. I can go into a little bit more detail if needed during the question time, but at least you should be aware of the fact that if you go to the GIFT website, you can find and download this paper, and it's, at least to my knowledge, it's one of the more comprehensive attempts at looking at the available evidence on this. On the participation side, again, there's less consensus, as I said, so there's actually much fewer ways for people to access information on participation practices in PFM across countries. In the Open Budget Survey, we've included since 2012 15 questions that look at different types of citizen engagement in budget processes with the executive, with parliaments, and with supreme audit institutions. So there's at least a basis upon which some opinion can be formed on what's happening with participation in PFM across countries. There's clearly a lot more need for a lot more work in this area. GIFT is definitely working and contributing to that field. And again, in the same GIFT paper on the impacts, we look at the impacts of participation as well, and the results are quite similar. Actually, participation seems to work better than just the transparency. Transparency produces some impact on certain specific variables. Participation seems to go deeper in terms of leading to more interesting outcomes like changes in public policy and development outcomes, while transparency limits itself to more sort of intermediate outcomes. Again, there's not much evidence out there on impact, but whatever evidence there is, it is quite positive. Finally, to conclude my presentation, let me just sort of put on the table 5 key issues and questions that I think should be at the back of people's minds who are thinking about these issues and who are working in this issue, around these issues. First, the fact that we still see huge variation in the levels of transparency and participation in PFM across countries, and we still have quite limited knowledge about what it is, what are some of the key factors and incentives that bring governments to adopt and sustain reforms in these areas. Again, there's some ongoing work which I'm coordinating for GIFT on incentives for fiscal openness, which will become available in the coming months. But this is definitely an area that is still under researched and sort of not well understood. And this links to the second question, which is about the assumed link between transparency, participation, and accountability, which many people talk about. I think this should be sort of deconstructed and questioned in many ways. And you know, the more interesting questions is how can we actually best think of the potential links and the actual links that exist between these different concepts in PFM, and what are some of the contextual and PFM specific characteristics that can facilitate a virtuous cycle where basically the availability of budget information brings about increased citizen engagement, and citizen engagement in turn brings governments to respond to citizen requests and demands. There's a key question about the role that external actors like donor agencies or even actors like the International Budget Partnership in support to civil society can play. Research shows that it's been quite a contradictory role so far, so there's quite a bit of reflection that needs to happen on that, and it's something that we're partly contributing to. How can we avoid excessive expectations about what transparency and participation in PFM can bring about? There's often the tendency when these ideas become sort of common currency in development discourse to sort of think that they are the silver bullet that will solve a whole range of problems, and I think there's a healthy dose of realism that needs to be injected in the debates here. And finally, and quite importantly, I think it's important to come to a definition of what we might term sort of meaningful transparency and participation. So transparency that makes sense in the context where it is being promoted, and that responds to users' needs and priorities. And the same goes with participation. So creating mechanisms for engaging citizens in ways that allow them to have their voice heard and to influence public policy in a way that is relevant to their needs and priorities. So I will stop here, and I look forward to Dominik's presentation that will follow mine, and to the questions that will come after that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paolo. Dominik, I guess go right ahead.
Yeah, let me just share the presentation. Thank you very much. I think what I'm going to say follows on very much from Paolo's presentation, focusing a bit more on corruption in public financial management. And so what I want to focus on is actually briefly on the types of corruption within PFM, but then much more on the way in which PFM is used as an anti-corruption tool, and what the underlying thinking, underlying theories of change are, what the evidence basis is, and then raise a few wider questions coming from that. So I have a small number of slides, and hopefully then the two will set us up nicely for the discussion. I think the starting point really, when we talk about corruption in PFM, is what do we mean by public financial management? I think it's kind of worth breaking it down into some of the different processes involved. Of course, it starts with revenue mobilization, taxation, the licensing, for example, of and for natural resource exploitation, but also revenue and customs processes. There's a budget preparation and resource allocation, an area for what I call grant corruption, where corruption can lead to massive shifts in the way that government expenditure is allocated. Budget execution, everything from payroll and procurement to accounting and the auditing of expenditure. So it incorporates everything that all the aspects of the management of public funds and finances. So why are we interested in corruption in the context of PFM? Well, one reason is obviously that the budget is a huge part of most countries' economy. You know, it's very often the largest part of many countries' economy. So corruption within that has substantial effects and impacts not just on economic growth, but also in particular on poor growth and issues of inequality, but also directly affects the provision of public services. You know, because corruption might deprive the state of revenue to fund its core activities, or it might lead to the redirection of funds towards particular public services or to particular areas, and therefore deprive others of these services, and might affect the quality of these services, either because funds corruption revenue mobilization has reduced the funds available, or because corruption in the delivery of them reduces the quality and their cost. I think importantly though, there's also a degree of path dependency in why donors are concerned about corruption in PFM, and that is that all aspects of public financial management have been a core part of donor activity, and not least with the emphasis on direct budgetary support. Any corruption within PFM has a direct effect on donor spending, on the way in which donor funds are used. So there are huge value for money concerns as well, and in particular protecting development funding that have led to the focus on addressing corruption in PFM. Importantly, though, I think PFM is also an anti-corruption instrument. So there is a wider view that by improving PFM and through transparency, participation, and other technical reforms, we can address problems of corruption within a country more generally. And I think there's a very particular underlying theory of change that informs that. The notion of corruption, or the understanding of corruption that informs the anti-corruption discourse around PFM is very much that corruption is a principal agent problem, and it relies very much on Klitkart's famous definition of corruption, that corruption is opportunity plus discretion minus sanctions. Problematic as this particular definition is, I think it very much infuses much of the discourse around corruption and PFM. So corruption is very much seen as a consequence of a lack of information or asymmetric information, i.e. that principals, be they the public or be they senior government officials, lack the information that the agents, i.e. the government or other officials have, and they exploit that information difference to their own advantage. Hence, reducing that information, the asymmetry in information through greater transparency, or reducing the discretion that they have in deciding on expenditure, for example, would reduce corruption. So the first key element is the idea that reducing discretion will reduce the opportunities and the incentives for corruption. And the ways in which reforms within PFM aim to do that is through greater transparency, which reduces the discretion that actors have because they're more observed, or by standardizing and automating processes, for example, payroll processes or procurement processes, or by opening up budgetary processes and increasing the participation, in particular, of beneficiaries within them. The kind of second pillar of this is around sanctions, the idea that stronger sanctions will reduce the incentives for corruption. But of course, sanctions are only as good as the monitoring systems that make it able to detect corruption and apply sanctions consistently and actively. So in a sense here, transparency and greater sanctions go together. But there's also the view that having tougher sanctions, for example, a tougher legal framework, coupled with more consistent and regular application of the particular framework, will help to deter corruption more effectively. But of course, it kind of links back to the ability to actually observe it and to detect it, because without this, sanctions will not have any effect. So while this view of anti-corruption in PFM very much looks at it as a principal agent problem, there are alternative ways to think about it, which are not necessarily kind of picked up by the policies proposed and by the way in which we tend to think about it. And I think it's important to recognize that corruption in the context of PFM can be a completely rational response to the particular environment. When I was working in Kosovo, we worked on procurement corruption. One of the issues that we saw fueled this was actually threats by senior political figures against municipal procurement officers who were threatened either with job losses or actually with violence. So it was a perfectly rational response of these particular officials to engage in corruption, not necessarily to their own benefit, but to the benefit of others in the environment they were working in. But importantly, it can also be a collective action problem. For example, in the context of petty corruption, there's sort of low-level administrative corruption, where not engaging in corruption puts individuals or companies at a competitive disadvantage because everybody else is engaging in it. If sanctions are low, if the risk of detection is very low, then the incentive not to engage in it is very low. And if everybody else is doing it, you put yourself at a disadvantage. And that very much that can very much then entrench that. So what does that mean for anti-corruption interventions and the form that they take? I think it's worth noting that most of them are largely what we can call technical reforms, not necessarily political reforms. That is, their focus on the standardization or the simplification of processes, for example, the simplification of tax codes or standardization of payment processes. They focus on greater transparency of budget-related information by providing more detailed breakdown of expenses or of income, by making information available to the public more readily and faster, and therefore enabling effective auditing or enabling greater transparency. But I think there are actually a range of important political reforms in this context, in particular around participatory budgeting, involving the monitoring and the by beneficiaries. There is increasingly, I think, a focus on the automation of processes and the introduction of new technologies. For example, through the automation of payment processes and payroll processes, or issues such as e-procurement, which are of course not limited to PFM, but there's also in the business world a big emphasis on e-business and on e-procurement. So it's not just in the public sector that we see these kind of reforms. And the big debate about the decentralization of PFM, away from the central level, in the sense closer to the beneficiaries, to increase transparency and accountability for spending. What about the evidence? We did a review of the evidence, which was published by U4 in 2012, where we reviewed a range of donor interventions and donor anti-corruption interventions to see how effective these interventions were, but in particular how strong the evidence for their effectiveness was. And it is not very clear on this particular presentation, so you have to look at the publication. But PFM appears in the top right corner. It is in a sense the only one of donor-funded reforms where we have both strong evidence that where there's strong evidence and strong evidence that it is effective. One of the reasons why there is strong evidence compared to many other interventions that the data is a lot better. Data in the context of anti-corruption intervention is always a problem because corruption is by its nature a clandestine activity. But in the context of PFM, we tend to have much better data, in particular through the public expenditure tracking surveys and similar devices. So here we can move away, in a sense, from the broad correlations that we see in the early literature that highlights that, yes, strong PFM systems are correlated with lower corruption, or lower perceptions of corruption, where we don't necessarily know whether both of these things might be driven by something else, such as stronger state capacity, or whether it is actually a stronger PFM system that drives lower perceptions of corruption. But with this much better data and more nuanced data, we're actually able to establish a much clearer direct effect of one on the other. What also comes out of the evidence around PFM and anti-corruption is that many of these reforms seem to interact, but we don't exactly know how they interact. So we see, for example, that stronger and sort of more complicated and complex PFM systems tend to be associated with lower levels of corruption, but we also see quite substantial variation in the nature of strong PFM systems that are associated with lower corruption. So complicated systems that have very, very different characteristics might still have similar outcomes with regard to corruption. And we don't really fully understand these interdependencies yet. However, there is also, I think, a strong recognition of a link between transparency reforms on the one hand and sanctions on the other. Going back in particular to the kind of pioneering work of Reinicke and Svensson around education budgets in Uganda, which highlight that merely transparency actually doesn't really help to reduce corruption. It is transparency coupled with sanctions that tends to support that. When we talk about PFM and anti-corruption reforms, I think it's important to also consider the wider political economy of PFM and corruption. Now, as I said at the beginning, PFM is a huge part of the budget is a huge part of most countries' economies, and therefore corruption within PFM has a very important political dimension and has an important development of grant corruption within it. Licensing for natural resource exploitation tends to happen at quite a high political level, and not by small bureaucrats. The allocation of special tax status to large enterprises, for example, again, tends to happen at a very politically connected level rather than at a bureaucratic level. However, even low-level corruption, for example in procurement, can be the result of political pressure, or can have an important political dimension. And I think here some of the kind of interesting tensions start to come in. We might want to reduce discretion and reduce the autonomy of civil servants, but actually protecting the autonomy of civil servants against political pressure can be equally important in particular contexts to reduce corruption. So in many ways, what it requires is quite a nuanced analysis of the political economy, moving beyond merely technical interventions. The budget is a hugely important source of patronage, and that I think inherently mitigates against transparency and procedural openness. So it's a big obstacle to, I think, the issue raised earlier in Paolo's discussion as well, of how do we encourage governments to accept greater transparency and accept greater participation within budgetary processes when these are so important to maintain their patronage coalitions. And of course, the kind of technical reforms that are very often central to anti-corruption reforms in the context of PFM are very unlikely to deal with problems of political capture. So if corruption shapes budgetary processes at a very high political level, no amount of transparency or participation at a later level around budget execution is going to have much impact on that, in the sense that has happened. The distortionary effects have happened already. I've listed a few readings which will be in the reading pack, which will be available shortly. And I just wanted to conclude with kind of a couple of key questions that really come out of this. I think the first key question is, how can we strengthen the political motivation for reforms, anti-corruption reforms, in the context of PFM? So how can we overcome some of the political economy problems? I think the second question is partly an evidence question, but I think also a question for policy, and that is, what are the linkages between different PFM interventions, and how can we understand them better and develop them better and design anti-corruption policies that take full account of these linkages? I think for me the third key question is, if PFM is, and the budget more widely is one of the key instruments that we have in trying to shape the development paths of a country, how can we use the kind of technical reforms that are available for kind of political ends? That is, how can we use them to strengthen the willingness to engage in these wider dialogues about development, but also about anti-corruption and openness and transparency? So I leave it at that, and I hope that's a good basis for the discussion.
Thank you very much, Dominik. If anybody out there in the audience has if you have any questions or you want to make any points or suggestions, please go ahead and type them in the chat box, and we'll try and take as many questions as we can in the time we have. While we're waiting for people to type in their questions, I don't know, do you have any reaction you want to give? I have maybe a couple of questions as well.
Yeah, maybe just a few comments from me. So I thought those were two very interesting presentations, and I like the way that both of them emphasize the difficulties as well as the attractions of work in the area and the politics of these concepts, because I think those are things which are sometimes understated. People pretend it's easy, and as I think Paolo was saying, there's excessive expectations for a new idea, And then when it doesn't quite live up to the excessive expectations, then there's a sort of rebound and people lose interest. And we need to be realistic. And I think there's been a long trend of people ignoring the politics of PFM. So I thought it's very good that those were emphasized. On the evidence, Brian mentioned that the GSDRC's done this study recently for DFID, trying to map what evidence there is on the impact of PFM interventions. And I think we were surprised by how relatively little solid, rigorous evidence there was across the field of PFM. So in a way, it's not surprising that we're reporting limited evidence in these fields, because there hasn't been much study done. And one of the reasons why there hasn't been much study done is I think there are a lot of methodological challenges to getting a convincing result in this field. One of the things we found was that a lot of the studies were looking at multiple interventions and multiple possible results, and it was very hard to credibly attribute a particular intervention to a particular result. So I think there's a lot more work to be done, and some of the work that Paolo mentioned that's come out very recently, I think, is opening up new areas, which is good. From my point of view, as a past practitioner and consultant and now lecturer in the field, I find the idea of transparency intrinsically attractive. I can remember as an early practitioner in British local government, we had a strange transparency arrangement where once a year we had to put our entire accounts on public display, and members of the public could come in. And the paradox was virtually no one did come in and look, but the act of putting them on display made everyone take things much more seriously and scared people about what would happen if anything was done wrong. So I think transparency has a very powerful effect. But as Dominik was saying, maybe you need further things to give it the full leverage. And I think then we start running into difficulties, some of which have already been mentioned. It seems to me that in a lot of countries, the norms and the cultures and the values are ones which expect corruption to happen. And a lot of the technical reforms in financial management, particularly around the control and implementation phases, depend on one person overseeing another person within the system. But if the norm is for corrupt behavior, then all of those systems really fall apart. And I think that's quite a fundamental challenge, that we need a reform beyond the PFM systems to make those control systems work. And so that kind of leads you on to participation, and whether participation can be the lever that makes things work. And we were surprised in our evidence study about just how many studies there were of participation relative to other aspects of PFM, but nearly all at local government. And I suppose one thing that I'd like to throw into the discussion is how far and how deep participation can be on central government, national government, PFM processes. And my worry is that travelling around the world, I think sometimes I see participation being offered up as a kind of substitute for democratic procedures that aren't working. And my fear that maybe the participative processes, especially at national level, themselves would be unrepresentative. And so you substitute one set of problems for another set of problems. But I'm kind of quite keen on participation, not so much at the budget making stage, but at the implementation, at the control stage, where it seems to me even some unrepresentative participation, if it's throwing up issues, is kind of unobjectionable. It's got to be a good thing. So that's a few ideas from me, but I know we've got other people coming in online with comments and questions, so I'll stop there.
Okay. Maybe I mean, Dominik or Paolo, do you want to respond to any of that? Particularly the last point is how deeply can participation really impact at the national government level?
Yes, maybe let me come in quickly. First of all, maybe reinforce the point that Simon made on the methodological challenges of producing credible evidence on the impacts of different aspects of public financial management, but at least in our case more linked to transparency and participation. It was definitely something that we found in our review. There were lots, even I think Dominik also mentioned, a lot of quite a few statistical studies trying to link transparency and corruption, but doing it in a way that doesn't really tell you much about the direction of causality or what specific aspect of transparency is actually having an effect on some specific aspect of corruption. There's only a few studies that are really able to sort of tease out some of the specific mechanisms that are necessary to establish these positive linkages and the evidence of positive impact. So there's definitely a big gap there in terms of research and evidence that needs to be filled. We also found the same thing that Simon said on participation being the evidence on the impact of participation being mostly at local government level. This is a challenge that we face quite a lot, especially when we deal with the Open Budget Survey and the fact that it tends to focus on the national level. So we've developed a number of questions and indicators that try to measure mechanisms and opportunities for citizen engagement at the national level. We see that there's actually a lot less happening across countries, but there are some very interesting experiences that are starting to emerge. Some of them that link the local and the national. So, for example, the whole experience with bottom-up budgeting in the Philippines is quite interesting. It does local participation, but all of that sort of flows up to affect national level budget policy making. But there are also, innovative ways of thinking about how participation can happen at the national level. The Brazilian experience with sector councils is quite an interesting one. There's actually quite a comprehensive and complicated structure of sector stakeholders sort of feeding up their inputs and views on sector policy and budget making, all the way up to national councils that interact directly with sector ministries, both in policy making and in implementation, but also some uses of IT tools. So, for example, the South Korean government sort of having an open window on the Ministry of Finance website where any citizen can provide inputs on ideas for fiscal policy making, different types of initiatives that either individuals or groups they have a possibility of feeding inputs into the budget making process. So it's definitely an area where a lot more needs to be done, and there's definitely not much evidence about impact reaching national level, but where there's an increasing pool of interesting experiences that can be drawn upon to sort of see what can be done and actually test whether those things are making any difference. And again, I'd like to point people to the set of case studies that GIFT has finalized over the past year, because I think those provide quite a wealth of evidence of at least what's happening out there, not necessarily going all the way into the impact.
Maybe just to very briefly add to that, I think one of the key challenges at the national level was the question of capacity as well, because budgets get just so much more complex, and the information is at an aggregate level much more difficult to interpret them, but also to fully think through what the consequences of particular budgetary items are once you sort of follow them all, the kind of the chain all the way through, and decisions are. So it's having actors who can meaningfully participate in these processes, either representative or not, but in particular, go actually the technical capacity to fully participate in those and to interpret budgets, to make them legible and understandable for non-experts. I think it's a really important part and a possible area of reform that we're going to focus on. It highlights how these link to other parts of anti-corruption reform, such as strengthening civil society, for example, to develop the capacity of actors who can actually provide these kind of input and services.
Thanks. We have a few questions from the audience in the sidebar at the moment. Abdul Rahman asks, how objective can PFM assessments be, given the lack of evidence available about the outcomes of reform initiatives and the political pressures? Do you have any thoughts on the objectivity of these kinds of assessments?
Let me maybe quickly. I thought that was quite an interesting question. My take on this is that PFM assessments can be as objective as you want them to be, and I mean we certainly strive for objectivity when we set up the ways in which we carry out our open budget survey to assess levels of transparency in PFM systems across countries. And I can, Luis, whom I see is also listening in, can tell of PIFA's experience trying to make their assessments as objective as possible and trying to limit the ways in which sort of subjective assessor opinions can come into the picture. So to me the key aspect is not necessarily how objective PFM assessments can be, because you can make them as objective as possible, is really to what extent objectivity comes at the expense of relevance and of sort of contextually designed interventions. So the great danger that we often face, that PIFA faces, that any type of objective assessment faces, where you try and adopt common yardsticks across a set of different contexts, is that those yardsticks will be utilized to sort of inform technical reforms that are not necessarily suited to address the internal and external political pressures that Abdul Rahman is talking about, and therefore lead to reforms or interventions that will not have the expected impact and the expected outcome. So a key challenge for me is not is how to match objectivity and contextually relevant knowledge in the design of reform interventions, of policy interventions of different kinds.
And just to add to that, I think I'd go along with Paolo that you can make quite objective assessments of the PFM systems, but that's not the only thing we're interested in. We're interested in impacts, and it's rather more difficult to measure impacts. And then on top of that, it's very difficult to measure the causality. How far did the system cause the impact? And on top of that, what we're doing, what's of interest to donors, for example, is what would be the impact of trying to improve a particular system or doing a particular intervention. And that in turn has difficulties in getting the evidence. It's a bit like knowing that cholesterol is associated with heart disease, which is not the same as knowing that an intervention to reduce cholesterol levels will lead to a reduction in heart disease. So we've got quite good evidence, which is beginning to be used by researchers on the PFM systems, but that's only one part of the entire system that we're trying to understand in terms of knowing what interventions to try and support.
Dominik, do you want to jump in on anything, or shall we?
I think relevant to add that I think it's important to make a distinction between objectivity, which is ultimately about who does the assessment and what is the method of that assessment, versus the methods you need to establish impact on causality. And I think they're two distinct questions. I think it's important to keep them separate.
Yeah.
Stefan asks an interesting question. All right, Paolo, you rattled off several examples in the Philippines and Brazil and South Korea of different kinds of interventions. Stefan, I guess, is thinking about how do external actors support various kinds of interventions. Were any of those examples, or are there others where international donors have been able to work effectively and make a difference in PFM reform, particularly at the sort of the higher political level?
So, I mean, reflecting on Stefan's question, my general sort of reaction to his question would be that there aren't many examples where external actors have worked effectively to understand political drivers of PFM reform, whether in transparency and participation or others. I mean, results of previous research I've done point to the fact that certainly there's a lack of a serious sort of a thought-through understanding of what the political context looks like in each country and what impact that might have on one hand on government willingness to introduce reform, but also for reforms to basically stick over time and generate the expected impact or the expected outcome. But there's also a range of issues that come from the fact that donors often there's multiple donors working in the PFM field in any country, and there's not necessarily a well set up coordination mechanism to ensure that whatever support the government receives, it's sort of structured in a way that provide consistent incentives for government to improve the key aspects of the public financial management systems. I mean, I've seen this in previous research on, more broadly on public financial management, and we are seeing a very similar thing currently in some research that we're doing with a group of donors looking at interventions specifically related to promoting transparency, budget transparency in public financial management systems. There's multiplicity of approaches, a multiplicity of uncoordinated actions, and that of course creates the space for governments to take advantage of whatever support comes in without necessarily having to seriously think through and seriously commit to any specific reform, because there will always be some donor interested in supporting something, basically. But I mean, that might sound like a bit of a too skeptical or too negative a view. Something that we have been working on, and that's in fact, in many countries, IBP is an external actor as well, trying to contribute to a similar set of reforms and pursuing a similar set of outcomes. Something we have been trying to work with and to promote, also in collaboration with some donor agencies, is the idea of approaching PFM reforms and approaching transparency and accountability in PFM through an ecosystem approach, where it's kind of like applying political economy analysis to public financial management, trying to understand who are the set of actors that are relevant within the field in any specific country. What are some of their, how do they collaborate with each other, and what are some of the formal and informal aspects of these collaborations, and to what extent these lead to sort of information becoming available in a way that allows for government to be held accountable. We call this the budget accountability ecosystem approach. There's some ongoing work that we're doing on this. I'm happy to sort of follow up for anybody who wants to hear more about this. I definitely think that this is an area, and more broadly, this sort of call for a political economy approach to governance reforms, the whole debates around doing development differently and thinking and working politically around some of these things. There's a lot of talk about it, but I still have to see, or at least have to see, hard evidence of donors and international actors, external actors more generally, changing their ways, not just changing the way in which they talk about issues, but changing the way in which they design and implement their interventions. And one key aspect of this, in my view, of course, is sort of project design and all, but the issue of coordinating among different external actors is also very important.
Maybe just 2 points. 2 points, and I think the first one is a kind of word of warning, and that is, yes, we can probably find a range of successful cases, but the fact that we make the argument that what is really important is the underlying political ecosystem, or the political economy of it, also suggests that it's very difficult to generalize from those to other cases. So just because something was successful in that case might not tell us very much about how to do it in a different context. We need to be very careful how we transfer lessons from one case to another. But trying to look at an example of a successful case, I mean, Georgia is an interesting case. Whether it's successful, it's certainly a very interesting case because the way the Saakashvili government promoted very particular reforms, which were seen as reducing corruption in the context of PFM but also other areas, but produced some very targeted reforms because they knew that these particular reforms would also hit particular indicators, which then improved their ranking in a range of indicators, such as the Doing Business Survey and others. So they took a very, very strategic approach to addressing these. And so it tells us a lot about incentives. So it wasn't so much that these were pursued with donor assistance, or that this is what led them to pursue them, but it was the wider environment and the wider set of incentives that they had, because it affected their relationships with multilateral organizations, with key states such as the US or organizations of the European Union, because they performed very well according to particular indicators which these actors used to measure particular things. So it helped them to kind of show in some form rapid progress, incredible progress, while the substance of the reforms was, and to what extent it was just a move from one area to another. The problem was sort of shifted from one area to another, sort of remained. But I think it's a slightly salutary lesson as well around measurement of success of some of these, because yes, we measure success by performance in particular indicators, but these very often only measure a very specific aspect, and they allow us to, or allow governments to game, in a sense, to game the system and try to target particular ones.
Lewis asks a question about a potential model for engaging in PFM. He asks whether anybody has looked at whether a model like the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commissions has relevance for engaging in PFM reform. Do either of you want?
Can I quickly come in on that? I mean, I think the quick answer is I haven't seen anything like that anywhere. But it struck me as a very interesting idea, and I was thinking of having victims and perpetrators of corruption kind of sitting across the table and talking to each other, and it made me it reminded me of some work that a number of our civil society partners in different countries do, which is basically bringing the argument against corruption around the live costs of corruption, and what I mean. A recent example that comes to mind was in Mozambique. There was this big scandal about the government bypassing parliaments and everybody else and signing almost like a ghost contract indebting itself for $150 million US to buy some fishing vessels and patrol boats from some French company. It created a huge level of debate. The Secret Service was involved, so it was a clear case of not only gross mismanagement, but clearly a case of major corruption. And the civil society groups that works with us in Mozambique, they published this brief that basically had that total cost to the state of entering into this bad deal with this French company. What was the cost of that in terms of the number of schools that could have been built, the number of health posts, the number of rural roads and bridges, or whatever, you name it. And I was thinking, on the basis of that, if you could set up a mechanism like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where you actually brought together the people who signed the deal and who are benefiting from it privately, and the people who have to forego those basic services that are so scarce in Mozambique, to what extent that could engender some interesting reflection and some interesting kind of sort of negative incentives, adding to the list of mechanisms that Dominik was talking about in terms of preventing corruption in PFM, having some kind of participatory mechanism that actually brings to life the live costs of corruption and mismanagement.
I think there's an inherent challenge and a kind of difference between them, which is important to kind of keep in mind. That is, these transitional justice processes tend to be of individual relations between perpetrator and victim. And of course, in the case of corruption, very often the cost is quite diffuse. So while the benefit accrues to a very small number of people, the costs are borne by a very large number of people. And so that to establish that relationship in a meaningful way can be difficult. It's also backward-looking, which I think is another problem, and it doesn't necessarily look at kind of structures and systems in the way that a PFM approach would. So I think for corruption more generally, I think the idea of transparency and sort of making people face the costs of what they do, even if they're diffuse, could be certainly an interesting approach. We're interested to see whether it would be effective and whether it causes a change in thinking or a change in behavior. But in the context of PFM, I can't necessarily see how it would then affect systems and structures, which seem to be so central to that. It's also important to kind of remember that most of these transitional justice mechanisms happen after a change of regime. So they are not necessarily a process to, they are kind of a process to achieve closure after a certain time, and it might be too late for it to have make a meaningful difference, because those who would be subject to it are almost by definition no longer in power. Because if there were, they would be very unlikely to face these kind of mechanisms. So you come back to the kind of political economy argument. In the absence of this kind of regime change, those who are responsible are always unlikely to face this kind of mechanism, this kind of treatment, and you might then risk such a process to be a kind of either a process of revenge or a way of dealing with opponents, which we see already in some countries that anti-corruption mechanisms are almost used as the way of controlling opposition or managing struggles within a regime. So I think there are certain risks associated with it that one should be aware of as well.
See, Stefan has pointed out that that the ODI is doing some work doing development differently principles to PFM reform that might be relevant. I don't know if anybody here can say anything more about that, or shall we set that as a homework assignment to go and look up what they're doing?
I'm happy to comment on it. I'm actually on the Bsi Advisory Board, and I have been following what they do over the past few years. I mean, I do agree with Stefan that it's not all doom and gloom, and there's an increasing certainly an increasing awareness of these issues in the governance field more generally, and in the PFM field just as much. I mean, I co-teach every January a course at the Kennedy School with Matt Andrews and others on different approaches to PFM reform, and there's always quite a lot of people who are interested, and these are not just donor people, but actually people who work within governments across a number of developing countries. What I find, sort of broadly speaking, what I find is that, as I was saying before, that increasing awareness has not generated a large range of different types of interventions. I think BSI is certainly an interesting experiment. I'm not sure to what extent what they're trying to do is actually, I mean, they're certainly trying to work in a different way, which is basically work much more in a responding to government needs and priorities rather than trying to impose sort of a foreign-generated technical agenda of any sort. But I'm not sure to what extent that actually leads to such a different way of working, or if it actually generates the kinds of impacts that we don't see in the PFM field traditionally, in the traditional PFM approach. As Stefan notes, it's still kind of too early to tell whether BSI is working a lot better than any of the other approaches. It's certainly very appreciated by governments because it works as a resource that is a lot more flexible and a lot more responsive than many of the other types of support that they get. What I'm still unconvinced about is to what extent it is actually, it's doing its work differently. I'm not sure to what extent it's doing development differently, and actually promoting something that an approach that really takes into account some of the deeper political drivers of and incentives of PFM reform across countries. Again, but this is, we can continue this conversation offline, and I do agree with Stefan that there are some examples of more interesting work happening.
Caputo has asked a question about the Brazil and Philippines examples that were cited, and can you say anything more about about these interventions?
Sure. So on the Philippines, so I can say more on the Brazil case than on the Philippines case. The Philippines case is more recent. We've recently done like an interview on these issues with the person who was basically leading these reforms from the Philippines government side, and we'll be producing some results from that in a couple of months or so. But if you take a look, so I guess the best piece of work that you can look at the moment to try and understand some of that is the Open Budgets book that Brian mentioned at the beginning, where we have a set of country case studies which include Brazil, which look exactly at what are the key drivers behind transparency and participation reforms in the budget process over, again, across these countries. In the Brazilian case, it was a combination of factors. It was the democratization process that happened in the late 80s with the return from dictatorship to democracy, and the large role that civil society played in that transition process, which basically meant that as soon as democracy was restored, there was a very active civil society that was interested and willing to engage with government, interested and willing to access and use information of different types, including budget information. So there was kind of a supply-demand, a meeting of supply and demand on both sides of the state-society divide. But there were also some, very clear incentives and drivers that came from fiscal crises. The Brazilian government found itself pretty much broke in the mid-90s, and it had to introduce some pretty drastic reforms. And one of the instruments that it decided to use mostly to keep state governments under check and to keep the rest of the public administration under control was to introduce transparency reforms that would allow basically not just central agencies but society at large to know where the money was going and have a better idea of who was using the money more or less effectively. So I mean, these are two of the main drivers in the Brazilian case. What we found across a number of other cases was that corruption scandals, sort of media pressure after corruption scandals was a big driver for reforms. And in some cases, external actors did play an interesting role. This was not necessarily in aid-dependent countries where there's some of the issues that I spoke about earlier in terms of too many actors trying to promote the same type of reforms and not being very coordinated with each other, but governments actively seeking external advice and external inputs in terms of interesting models that were working in other countries and actively adapting them to their own context and trying to learn from what had worked in different countries. Again, this is very, very broad brush. One of the key readings in the reading pack is the summary chapter from the book, and you can find most of this and some more information, Caputo, in that chapter.
Thanks. I don't know if there are any other questions out there in the audience. If you have any, type them quickly. I think we'll have to wrap up in just a few minutes. Do you have anything you want to?
Yeah, I was just, as we sort of coming towards the end, thinking about the lessons from history. And one example of a fairly significant improvement coming out of corruption is the UK, which in the first half of the 19th century was an incredibly corrupt government. And the story that's usually told is that there were a series of reforms in the mid-19th century which turned that round. And I think they did, but it took a lot longer than people realise, something like 50 years. There was a set of reforms which was around what we would call PFM processes, auditing, accounting, and so on. And there was a change in the way the civil service worked to professionalise it and make it much more merit-based in terms of recruitment. But there was tremendous resistance from within the civil service to those reforms, particularly on recruitment. And the way the reforms actually proceeded, in a way, was more incremental and more opportunistic than the story that's usually told. And ironically, the biggest opponent, I think, was the Ministry of Finance, the Treasury. There was one sort of interim reform which said that before you appoint someone, you have to have an interview of at least 3 candidates, and they apparently had 2 people who became known as the Treasury idiots, who were always put on every selection panel along with the person the Ministry of Finance really wanted, the Treasury really wanted, so they could subvert the intended reforms. And it took till around something like 1900 before those reforms were wholly implemented. And I think the other lesson of that reform is that they were reforming at a time when the emphasis was entirely on financial control. The challenge was to get the controls right and stop corruption. But there wasn't much interest in government performing well, because government was quite small and didn't affect people's lives that greatly, except maybe in times of war. But now we've got a dual agenda of getting the control right and the performance right. And it's much harder, partly because of something that Dominik talked about earlier, which is that the control side of things pushes us towards strong processes, very tight processes, but the performance agenda maybe pushes us towards greater discretion, having people near the point of service delivery with a lot of autonomy to use their information, use their closeness to the customers to get the use of resources right. And it's very hard to square that circle, I think, in a developing country, so that you get the balance right between those two things. So we're back to what we were talking about earlier, that this is not a quick win, it's not a magic bullet, it's something which is going to take a lot of time and a lot of persistence from all the actors involved to turn it around.
Okay, I guess we have 3 last questions here, so maybe we could take those fairly quickly and then wrap up, and we'll be on time. One question was from Simone, which was whether we had experience about providing information to the public. Dominik, you mentioned something about that earlier in when you were speaking. I don't know. Do you want to sort of very briefly expand on how to provide information to the public in a way that makes it understandable and that people can actually engage with it?
Yes, I mean, I think there's clearly experience in supporting, NGOs and other civil society organizations in budgetary scrutiny, or we see it in the context of EITI, for example, which is not the budget, but it's linked to that question, where there's been a strong emphasis on strengthening the capacity of civil society to understand these kind of accounts and actually scrutinize them and thereby provide accountability. So these mechanisms do exist, and I think they're kind of compatible with sort of standard programming and support that we see now. Can I pick up, I guess, give us sort of our last round of comments on Stefan's question as well?
Maybe we'll come to later. Maybe we'll just answer the last 3 questions in order if we can.
Okay, no problem at all.
Okay. Does anybody have any comments on in response to Samuel's question about donor agencies interfering in internal affairs and how you deal with that? I mean, that's a problem that afflicts all of development, doesn't it? Does anybody want to comment on that in the PFM context?
Sure. I mean, I think that basically there's 3 scenarios here, and in 2 of them donors are looked at as the unnecessary intruders. The first scenario is basically one where the government is aid dependent, and the government needs donor money. Donors provide some of the funding, but they also ask for specific reforms, and they are seen as the unnecessary intruder in a country's internal affair, but with a certain degree of acceptance that comes from the fact that the government does need the funding. There's other cases where the government, that maybe it's not an aid-dependent country and they don't really need the money anyway, and donors still come with some similar offerings. But in that case, the government can either turn them away or can basically decide to pick and choose a few of the things that it deems interesting. I mean, in some cases, some research that I did a few years ago, we sort of looked at how African governments deal with the donor community, and there were very few examples of aid-dependent countries that faced up to the donors and tried to establish a slightly more equal partnership. But those are often not countries that we cite or that people cite as examples of democratic openness, like Ethiopia and Rwanda and so on. So the unnecessary intruder syndrome, I think, is quite an interesting one and quite a common one, and it has different facets. And it's only in a very, very small number of cases where there's a sort of a fortunate coincidence of donor ideas and interventions and government openness to reforms. And often, as Dominik said, those come after political crisis or after political transition, or after some other type of sort of event that creates some of the conditions for reformers to have the upper hand in internal affairs. But unfortunately, those are usually quite isolated and often far behind. And one of the key things that I think donors as unnecessary intruders should give more attention to is to do more of the homework to try and understand when some of those windows of opportunities might open up, and be ready to act when that happens. And I think that's a challenge that, on average, external actors are not very good at facing.
Yeah, I don't think it's a tension one can avoid. I think it's very much part of the course. But I think that's also partly why so many of these reforms are framed in highly technical terms, because that makes them much more palatable and makes it, to some extent, easier to avoid some of the political question. We always talk about the importance of addressing the political economy, but of course that's also the really difficult bit and contentious bit to address. And by focusing on the technical side of questions of capacity, we can avoid those. And hence, I said, I think it's interesting to think about how we can use using technical reforms to achieve political change, and think about that linkage between the two, because that might open up certain opportunities. I think, follow up on Paolo's point, I think Angola is a really interesting case around its management of the oil budget, and where they have adopted a range of technical reforms on their own terms, which facilitated engagement with international markets and certain international organizations and partners, but very much on their own terms, because they could do so because they're no longer aid dependent. And because they benefited them, and they benefited the regime and its ability to control these particular flows. So we see substantial technical improvements without any changes in the underlying kind of political dynamics in this particular case.
Thanks. Last question to Stefan then. He's asking whether we can join things up, look at things in a more joined up way. We sort of disaggregate the PFM system and look at the revenue side and expenditure side. Is there any way to join this up and look at it in a more coherent way?
I think there is an inherent link between them right from the start, and that is that all questions of PFM ultimately pose questions of legitimacy. Legitimacy about how the government raises funds and from whom, how it spends them, and whether it spends them in a way that supports its the wider objectives of the society. And we just need to look at the current debate in the UK around revenue raising and about tax avoidance. Yeah. Issues broadly linked to PFM, that these things have become inherently linked. As there is greater pressure on the provision of public services, as we see in almost all developing countries where public services are a scarce resource, questions of revenue, how revenue is raised, and who contributes to revenue become central questions to the legitimacy of government.
Paolo, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, sure. Just a couple of quick thoughts. I mean, I think that's a very interesting point by Stefan. Of course, I mean, of course, there's the whole theory that you can see the budget as basically a social contract whereby citizens contribute to the pool of public resources and then get something back from it according to whatever politics mediates, basically. But I think we need to go beyond that, and it's interesting to note that in fact many governments also separate. Often you have a ministry that looks at expenditure and a ministry that looks at revenue. You have autonomous revenue agencies that basically do their job almost with no connections with what's going on the expenditure side of the budget. There's a whole in a number of countries the two processes actually happen very much in separate silos, and I think it would be a lot more helpful to think about the budget in a more integrated way, not just from a government point of view, because there's a lot that you can do on both taxation and expenditure that responds to fiscal policy and budget policy priorities. You can distribute resources, you can allocate benefits, you can distribute costs as well. As much as you can do through expenditures, you can do through your taxation system and your fiscal policy. So there's a lot to be said about better coordination on that. But there's also, I think, interesting work that's kind of ongoing under the broad heading of follow the money, where if you look at specific streams of revenue, say from extractive industries or from foreign aid or from other similar sources, then I think there's a lot of scope for doing work that tracks how that money is spent. I mean, some of these sources of funding, state rents of different types, are often outside of the social contract type approach, and therefore are more easily misused and the source of a number of problems. So approaching them from a follow the money point of view, where you try and link what's happening on the revenue side with what's happening on the expenditure side, holds quite a bit of promise in terms of transparency, accountability, and impact. Of course, again, it's just sort of an impression or something that is based more on intuition rather than real evidence. But I think there's a lot of scope for doing interesting work in these areas.
Thanks. We said we were going to finish at 4 o'clock UK time. It is exactly that time now. So I think I'll draw it to a close. Thank you to everybody who is participating online and sending in very interesting questions. It's great to have that kind of participation, even if it's only in a text form over online. And thank you to Paolo and Dominik both for your presentations and your comments, and thank you, Simon, for your comments as well. I think you've all highlighted some good, some promising evidence of success, even if it's limited. But there's evidence of success out there, and you've mentioned a number of interesting cases. Clearly, the challenge of measuring the impacts, the causality, is the challenge of measurement there is very high. So it's difficult to trace and analyze the links between transparency, participation, accountability, and kind of identify that and build up that virtuous circle that we were talking about. There seems to be a big challenge in coordinating among donor agencies, figuring out what role external actors can play in supporting reform processes. And there, as always, remains a big challenge in working up at the political level, how to strengthen the appetite for reform, how to use technical reforms towards political ends. So there's plenty of questions to be answered, but I think you've, as I said, laid out some very interesting evidence and examples of good, promising interventions and promising reforms. Thank you very much to everyone, and I look forward to announcing another event like this fairly soon.